In Chapter 3, we're going to pick up and start studying markets in more detail. As we've already discussed in previous chapters, we know that economies can be either market-oriented or government-oriented. We're now going to start studying the market mechanism in detail instead of just referring to it in general terms. And ultimately, we'll be discussing this through the model of supply and demand, which I'm sure most of you all are familiar with. Now, we're going to go back through it again, not because I don't think you already have a good understanding of it, but you'd be surprised that no matter how many times you work through this model, there are new things to learn. And many of those new things, as you mature in your education, you start with undergraduate level knowledge and you work your way up, it turns out that you end up learning a significantly larger amount as you go through the same material over and over again. So we're hoping that you'll be able to start integrating this now into your mind as a future business leader. All of these models will no longer just be things you memorized as an undergrad and forgot immediately as soon as you left, but will start to actually be part of your thinking. So that's our goal. So let's go ahead and dive into it and see if we can't figure out if we can make that happen. So what's this chapter all about? Well, the goal of this chapter is to explain how supply and demand really work in a market-based system. And we're going to figure out what determines the price of goods and services, and how does the price of a product affect its production and its consumption, and why do prices and production levels often change. So we're going to see that market systems change quite often in their details. Of course, the system as a whole, the legal structure and whatnot remains the same, but how individual firms and individual customers behave within the system changes constantly as different kinds of conditions, including prices, how they change. So, what do we mean by a market? How do you locate a market? Well, it's important to recognize that when we use the term market systems, we're talking about things based on markets, and markets exist wherever exchanges take place. Now, every market transaction and exchange therefore involves an exchange of dollars for goods or services in either product markets, for goods and services which come from what are known as product markets, or they're exchanges of dollars for resources, which we refer to as factor markets. Remember how we talked about the resources? We called them factors of production. And if you remember, we had a list of 4 of them. We had natural resources that under the rubric of land, we have the natural resources. Then we have labor resources, which is all human effort directed at production. Then we talked about capital, which is all the machinery and factory buildings and whatnot created by human beings to produce goods and services. And then our last factor of production was entrepreneurship, that special ability that entrepreneurs have when they're risking their own money through profit and loss in order to direct business firms to do the most good. So all of these are factor markets, and markets exist both for the final goods and services, where what we think of as ordinary consumers go into a Walmart or go into a Costco or whatever and buy a finished product. That would be the goods and services markets or the product market. But there's also a market for workers, and there's also a market for education. We're talking about in building up human capital. There are markets for the natural resources, and all the other resources as well also have markets. Now, markets can be either explicit or implicit. What do we mean by this? By explicit, we mean they're physically visible. So some markets, like the New York Stock Exchange, quite famously, and anytime you want to, you can just go Google a picture of, show me a video of the New York Stock Exchange, and there'll be a ton of them online. What we see in those markets is both buyers and sellers come together in a central location called the New York Stock Exchange, and they haggle over the price of, I want to sell, Apple computer stock, and someone else says, I'd like to buy Apple computer stock, and they haggle over the price. And since there's dozens of people both buying and selling, what ends up happening is it converges to what's called a market price, which we'll go into a lot more detail a little bit later on how that happens. But the point is, you can see the market physically. Now, other kinds of markets are virtually invisible, like the market for MBA programs. You are in one, right? And you have some kind of a voluntary agreement with Mercer University. They want to sell you something. You want to buy something. You want to buy educational services so you can build up your human capital. We want to sell it to you so that we can hire professors and do all the things that Mercer would like to do. So clearly an exchange is taking place. But you notice the market for higher education is virtually invisible. We don't actually see all the universities coming together at the Civic Center and every student in the country who wants to go to an MBA program all getting together and haggling with the different universities in one central location. We do, of course, for stocks. That's done in a central location in the city of New York at the stock exchange. It turns out the vast majority of markets are implicit. We know they exist, and I presume you all didn't just take the first college that came to mind. I presume you investigated more than one. And of course, colleges are reaching out to more than just the students we have now. We made offers to some students who chose not to come. We didn't make offers to some students who would like to come. And then of course, we made offers to you all, and you did want to come. So in all that haggling, which is not necessarily done the way you do at a car dealer where it's easy to see the haggling, but it's done implicitly. You all have made applications to more than one school. You made choices depending on both the cost of what the tuition is, what kind of scholarships could you get, what kind of loan package could they put together, what kind of quality is the school, what kind of reputation does it have, how convenient is it to your current place that you work, or are you willing to quit your job and move to a new city in order to go to an MBA program? All of those things are being discussed between you and your family and the colleges, and so there's a market for higher education. There's a market for houses. You don't see the actual market. We don't bring houses to a central location so you could haggle with the owners, but you can drive around with a real estate agent and you see multiple houses, and then over time you start to recognize, oh, in this particular neighborhood, houses of this particular quality, of this particular size, they all kind of go for right around $425,000 to $435,000. So you kind of get an idea of what a certain house is worth in a particular area because the market is, while not explicitly visible, you know it exists. So my point is, I just want you all to recognize is that the vast majority of markets are implicit and you don't actually see them, but they do exist because we know buyers and sellers are somehow communicating with each other, haggling in some way in order to finally come to a decision. Do we enter into a contract to make an exchange of the buyer giving money and the seller giving a good or a service? Now, last but not least on this, and actually not least by a far amount, this is actually one of the most important points to make. In markets, all exchanges must be voluntary. That's the legal mechanism of market systems or capitalism, is that all transactions must be voluntary. Only a government may legitimately use force. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that I am the owner of a, let's make me the owner of a car dealership. And I'm kind of short on the amount of sales help I have, and I'd kind of like to hire some new salespeople. Can I send out a press gang and kidnap you and force you to come to my office, to my car dealership and work for me? Well, no, you can't, right? In market systems, it must be voluntary. But can a government do that? Certainly. During wartime, the governments can have conscription, which we call the draft, where we can require young people to take a job in the government called being a soldier. So governments may do this, but in market systems, if they are market systems, the exchanges must be voluntary. If I'm the owner of a car dealership and I want you to work for me, I must make you an offer that you have the right to refuse. So if I offer you $50,000, but you're worth more than that because you know you can get another job with your degree that pays more than that, you can turn me down. But if it turns out that you're a worker who's right now making $40,000 a year doing your current job, you might very well be interested in coming to work for my car dealership for $50,000. So the point of it all is that every exchange that takes place in a market system has to be voluntary in order to qualify as an exchange in a market system. Now, who are the market participants? Market participants try to obtain the maximum returns from the scarce resources they have. So consumers are one group of market participants, and they maximize something that we call utility. This is a term in English. Utility means, in ordinary life, means usefulness, and utility can also mean satisfaction or benefit. So consumers try to maximize their satisfaction, their benefit, or their utility that they get from whatever their available income is. In other words, let's assume, just to have a nice round number, you make $100,000 a year. Now, do you want to simply squander your $100,000 a year on things that you don't even particularly like? Or are you going to be a careful consumer who tries to get out of that $100,000 the most satisfaction you can by making different choices? Well, I think we all recognize consumers try to maximize their utility. Now, business people, they try to maximize their profits by selling goods that satisfy demand while keeping their costs low. So what do we mean by that? Business people search out things that you as a consumer really, really like. So for instance, if you have a desire that you would prefer to eat naturally grown tomatoes rather than industrially grown tomatoes because of the differences in the fertilizers and the pesticides and things like that between natural and organic versus non-natural and non-organic, there will be some business person out there who will say, I will start myself an organic farm. I can charge more money for this product because certain people really desire the much higher quality product and therefore are willing to pay more for it. So even though it's going to cost me more money, because spreading manure is way more expensive and nowhere near as much fertilizer as a chemical fertilizer, but some customers prefer that. And so I'm willing to spend the extra money in order to fertilize naturally if I know I can charge more money to my customer. So we see that business people are constantly trying to figure out, how can I make a profit by finding a good or a service that satisfies the desires of my customers while still keeping my costs low enough that there would be a profit in this transaction for me. Now, of course, businesses don't just do this for producing organic food, they do it for literally everything. Every car company is trying to figure out, do Americans really want electric vehicles? If they do, we'd be happy to make them for them because I can charge a price that's high enough that I can make a profit. But if they'd really prefer to have gasoline cars, well, then manufacturers would do that as well. Remember, manufacturers aren't trying to save the planet. There's no reason to believe they are. What manufacturers want is to collect money from customers. And in a voluntary society, in a market system, the only way to do that is to find something that people truly want. And we say they truly want it because they're willing to sacrifice their money for it. And so that's the measurement device we use in a market-based system. Are customers willing to part with their money in order to have your particular product? And then last but not least, governments. What do governments do in market systems? Well, they should maximize general welfare of society. You notice I have the word should here in italics. This is a moral judgment that this is what governments should do. It's not a scientific statement of what governments actually do. Remember how we made that distinction between positive statements and normative statements in an earlier chapter? A positive statement is a statement that governments do maximize the general welfare. And that would be something you could investigate by doing a study. Do governments actually accomplish this? Well, as we've already pointed out, by looking at the corruption index in many societies, governments don't do that. So as a scientific statement, it's not true that governments generally try to maximize the general welfare of society. But as a normative statement, as a moral statement, do we all agree that that's what governments ought to be doing? It's what they should be doing. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's hard to imagine anyone claiming that governments have a moral duty to reduce the general welfare of their society. That would be very difficult to imagine anyone honestly claiming that's a moral duty of government. But unfortunately, what should be done and what is done are often two different things. We will do whatever we can in order to, educate our members of our society to want to move the government to move toward maximizing the general welfare of society. And of course, in an economics class, we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about political activity. That would be saved for, political science classes. But I think we all recognize ultimately we need political activity in order to reduce the total level of corruption in society. So these motives, as I just pointed out, they explain most of the things that you see in a market system. This is what you will see because these three groups are doing the things that are mentioned on this slide. Now, it turns out that most people move toward what are called specialization and then exchange. So let's think about why this is true. Now, why do we buy and sell goods and services? Why don't we just simply make them all ourselves? Well, it turns out that because of opportunity cost, most of us don't have the time, talent, or resources to produce everything that we would want. Just picture a car. How long would it take you to build your own car? How long would it take you to build your own house? You know, unless you're in the business of doing these things, you would be incredibly slow at it because you just don't have the skills. You haven't, not because you're stupid. Obviously, if you're an MBA program, you have the brains that's necessary to build a house, but you don't have the experience. It takes years of working in construction before you understand all the parts that it takes to build a home. So if you tried to build your own, you would probably do it very badly, and it would take you an incredibly long period of time. So in fact, do most people build their own homes? No, they don't, even if they're highly skilled people. What we normally do is we specialize in one thing, such as some of you all will become marketing managers for a large company, and you'll be part of coming up with the marketing program for your company, which you will be very good at because you've been doing it for many years and you've got lots of advanced training, and you'll make a lot of money doing that. And then you're going to hire someone else who has specialized in construction, and they spend all their time doing construction. Which of course means if they're doing all their time doing construction, they don't grow their own vegetables, right? They go to Publix and they simply buy their vegetables because contractors realize, I'm really good at being a contractor, I'm probably not really good at being a farmer, and if I take my time away from being a contractor to do farm work, then the total amount of income I'm earning from construction is going to go down, as we saw from the production possibilities frontier. I can't do both at the same time. I can't be a contractor 40 hours a week and simultaneously be a farmer 40 hours a week. So I have to make a decision. Which one of these am I going to specialize in? Am I going to specialize in being a farmer, or am I going to specialize in being a contractor? Once you specialize, you get a lot better at what you're doing, and presumably you're smart enough to specialize in the things that you have the lowest opportunity cost. In other words, if you hate math, don't specialize in computer science. It requires a lot of math, right? Don't become an engineer. That requires a lot of math. Find something else where your skills with human beings, like being in marketing or sales, works really well for you. And vice versa. If you are a heavy math person and you don't particularly like dealing with people because you don't understand emotional stuff very easily, but you really understand math and statistics and things like that, then go into engineering fields, computer science fields, where people appreciate your rigorous logical math way of thinking. Don't go into sales where you have to deal with people on a regular basis, right? So it's just, I think it makes perfect sense. The idea that we specialize in the things for which we have the lowest opportunity cost compared to other people, specialize in that, become incredibly productive at it, overproduce those things which we sell on the market, which of course gives us income, and then we now turn to others to purchase the things that we really want. So that's essentially the way all modern societies function this way. Very, very few people try to live on a subsistence farm where they produce all their own food, make all their own clothing, build their own house, tame their own animals, farm their own, tame the animal and then turn the horse into a plowing device. That would be incredibly difficult for most of us, and your income would be incredibly low because you're not specializing. You're not going to be very good at any one of those things. So modern societies are all based on specialization and exchange. Now, it turns out that this same logic applies to international trade. Not only do we as individuals specialize in some things and don't produce other things and we trade for them, nations as a whole have the same internal logic. Different countries, because of either the endowments of what their natural resources are, like Saudi Arabia sitting on a huge amount of oil, it makes perfect sense for Saudi Arabia to concentrate in oil production. It wouldn't make particularly good sense for Saudi Arabia to all of a sudden invest in becoming a computer-based society. They already have a natural advantage in oil. And then vice versa, if you were in Silicon Valley where everyone around you is doing computers and you've been to university to study computer science, it makes perfect sense in California to become an expert in computers. So different countries specialize in different things based on everything from the natural endowments that nature gives them, such as what kind of land they have, what kind of natural resources are under the land. They also specialize depending on what kind of educational system they have, and therefore how educated your workers are. And that will make a huge difference in what kind of production that you specialize, and how much capital you have, and all the other things that we talked about in previous chapters. So we know that nations can consume more in total and therefore make their population better off if they don't produce everything themselves. In other words, nations as a whole should also specialize in certain kinds of things, produce a tremendous amount of them, export some of those items for money, and then start buying from other nations those things for which they themselves are not particularly gifted or suited for. So I think it should be a relatively logical argument, and it's a very counter argument to those who believe that nations should go it alone and not be dependent on others. You can do that just like an individual person could do that. Like I said, you don't have to deal with farmers and contractors and things like that. You could literally live on a subsistence farm, grow all your own food, make all your own clothing, build your own house, but you would be incredibly poor if you did so, because there's no way you could do all those things and simultaneously build a John Deere tractor. So you're going to have to be dealing with, a horse-drawn plow, and even that would be incredibly difficult to build on your own. I could imagine you might be able to tame a horse, but how are you going to build the steel tip for the plow? How are you going to make the steel if you're living on your own individual farm and you refuse to trade with others? So I would imagine that you probably could not even live at the level of the poorest nation in the world. The average person who lives in that country will live better than you do if you tried to go it alone, even here in the United States. So specialization, division of labor, first really developed by Adam Smith in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, back in 1776. Adam Smith is laying out the logical argument as to why we have specialization, and then we trade or exchange with others, both at the individual level and also at the nation state level.